Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Deep Thoughts. Today we're going to go way out on a limb to talk about something I'm going to coin as atomic life. This is going to be sort of an experiment in thinking. So there's no proof of anything I'm about to say whatsoever. This is going to be sort of, hey, I have an idea. I'm going to talk about it, hopefully for about an hour. And if you'd share your impressions on it, it'd be cool. For any of you who've ever studied the visualization of the power of 10, it is that regardless of how much we zoom into things and zoom out of things, there appears to be an infinite loop. Things that are big, things that are small. You zoom out and the universe looks like a little dusty pile of stars. Now, part of that's kind of absurd because we haven't been able to actually see anything like that other than to turn our eyeballs and look at the galaxies, look at space as we see it in the sky, right? And regardless of how complex we make a device to look down into subatomic stuff, it always seems to have more complexity and more complexity. You know, hadron colliders and little Stanford colliders, and we just keep finding quarks, and then we find subatomic matter signatures that seem to be what quarks are made out of, and it just keeps going down infinitely. So it would be interesting to know if there was any finite cap on the end of infinity in the macro sense or infinity in the micro sense. Where are we in the middle of the whole thing? Because we would exist in the index between these 2 points of it doesn't get any smaller than this, it doesn't get any bigger than this. Are we directly in the center? Are we more towards the macro or more towards the micro? It's hard to say because when you look at the power of 10, meaning something is 10 times smaller than something else or 10 times bigger than something else, you know, we have theories that the sun is 93 million miles away and massive. That the star Sirius is even, 10 times more massive than our sun. More than 10 times massive. We have moons, we have atoms, we have human cells, right? We're made of what, 3 or 4 trillion cells? Our bodies? But you can't see it. So I'm going to come at this from a standpoint of, I don't think we really know what's inside an atom. We have developed a physical model that allows us to predict very basic traits of an atom. We use these physical models to accomplish tasks in chemistry. We know that we sense neutrons, protons, electrons, and we use those calculations to figure out how 2 substances will be attracted to each other, repel from each other, blend with each other. And so we have a fairly decent grasp on some of the principles of an atom. But what it's actually made out of, I'm going to tell you that we really don't know. And I'm going to review the things that we've discovered making this show, and then throw a whole new idea at you. Now, I grew up, again, a kid just absolutely nose buried into physics from the age of probably 9 up. And I didn't just read books and get interested in them. I went off and created my own research projects to start to try and fill in the holes of voids that were currently being presented by the books. So when I would read that we don't have a unified theory of the universe, I immediately gravitated to kind of creating a straw man on the wall of my mind and saying, it's almost like those forensics shows where there's a murder mystery and they put the Polaroids everywhere and strings between everyone, trying to find the connections and the motivators, motives for how people are associated. So in my brain, I found out about voids in science very early, and so what that does is that allows you to take in new information, not just as a mere exercise of academia, I need to know this or I want to know this, but to immediately ingest it with the paradigm of purpose for whatever is the mystery of the universe, such as unified theories and things. Now, I'm almost glad that I grew up with the bogus theory of the Big Bang, because then I didn't try to create any sort of theory about how the universe was created, because I think that's just a futile argument in general. You have to understand how it exists before you can theorize about how it began. And we know very little about how it exists. So the theory of, I'm going to go into the construction of an atom, because this episode is called Atomic Life. We know when you talk about hydrogen atom, you have the most fundamental atom that we know of, right? And you'll just read it, and you'll read about the parts and pieces, and you just go, okay, well, that's what it is. I ask no other questions. Proton, a neutron, electron. And you don't really, unless you're really acquisitive, and I wasn't this way when I was a kid, but when you're really starting out, you don't ask questions about what is an electron, what is a proton, what is a neutron. What you end up finding out is that it's essentially energy that behaves in a certain way, and it has a name because it behaves in that way. And if that's a little confusing, let me just make it real easy for you. You have 3 identical twins, Madagazi twins. They look exactly the same. If they have a mole, they have it on the same place in all their body parts, right? Incredible act of God. One guy becomes a country line dancer. The other one becomes a salsa dancer. And the other one becomes a square dancer. They're exactly the same thing, for all intents and purposes. But because one learned how to do a different dance versus another one, we only refer to them as the dance that they do, because they behave in a certain way. But they're made of the same stuff. They're all human beings. Quite frankly, they are identical in appearance. And the problem is that because we classify them by their dance, we don't realize they're made of the same stuff. And once we realize they're made of the same stuff, it opens up a lot of differences from what we know today versus what could be, in terms of how far can you take the theory of the power of 10, or the Mobius strip of existence, which is that the macro turns into the micro and the micro turns into the macro. In the late 80s, they came out with something called the Mandelbrot. Mandelbrot was a mathematician for IBM who had perfected a fractal algorithm that essentially is an algorithm that you would say A plus B equals C, and just before you rerun the algorithm, A becomes the value of C. And so you keep putting the results of the algorithm that you have back into the algorithm to continually create this exponential curve of either macro or micro. And it was ingenious. There were several, variations on this thing. But it showed you with the very simple algorithm, and I mean just the tiniest of math, how amazing and organic mathematic formulas can become close to reality, to the golden mean and that sort of thing, right? But now let me throw an idea at you here. What if I told you, and this is not, based on anything I can promise you or anything, it's just an idea for a split second to open your mind a little bit. You know that you have, if you believe everything that you've heard about physics, you have never seen a single atom at once. Zoomed up, just like, a petri dish and a microscope. You've never just been able to look at the glory of a single atom, ever. They're too small, right? All right, let's keep that in our brains. Now, I'm going to suggest a paradigm shift in your brain and let it exist for 10 seconds. The sun, what if the sun was nothing but one gigantic atom? In perspective to our existence, you are staring right at an atom. And its glorious nature of brightness and warmth is what happens when one gets close enough to an atom that you can start to register with your eyeballs, right? Your eyeballs register light of a certain frequency. But it has to be that big and it has to be that far away, however that is, for you to see it and feel it. The atoms that you're made out of, well, they're so shrunk down that they are unable to put off photons in a way that you can see them. You don't glow in the dark, for instance. Now we know that we have night vision goggles that can change the spectrum of light to thermal radiation, and all of a sudden we can see in the dark. So I've had 2 shifts in the last 2 years for what could be at the center of an atom. I want to take you through that very quickly here. There's a guy on the internet called Eric Dollard. And he's not necessarily on the internet. He's on the internet because people film him and talk to him. Dollard. He was a prodigy as a child. His father worked for the Navy as some sort of engineer. But he was brought into a laboratory that's estimated between $7 and $11 million in the late 70s. The laboratory was owned by the Navy and RCA. Why RCA, which for those of you who don't remember, was the company that patented color television a long time ago. That's why everything is black and white up to 1964, unless it was an RCA production. But RCA really got started helping the military with radar. And so they became filthy rich with their color TV patent and their radar technology from the government. So this laboratory was outfitted with some of the most modern stuff that anyone could get their hands on. And he was in there, I think, around the age of 11. And he was also mentored by the people who ran the laboratory. And they taught him a lot of stuff that correlates more with the Faraday to Tesla era of electronics, and saying essentially the physics has been a ruse for the people to explain what they can't understand, but to also keep them from innovating around those that own the market by teaching them bogus science. They told him, for instance, that the sun was a portal. They didn't really give a context for what that means, whether or not it's just a portal of energy, portal for something more intelligent. They did not say anything about, aliens flying out of the sun or anything like that. They just said it was a portal. But they also told him that the sun is a big plasma ball, and that all you're looking at is the crusty materials from the universe burning on its surface. But the reason why you have sunspots is that you're looking into the bowels of the sun. This is RCA and the Navy telling Eric Dollard this. They also helped him reconstruct the experiments to prove to himself that ether exists, something that physics was very quick to dismiss because it reveals so much about how the universe works. So when you introduce ether, and they gave him a big wire and had him wave it around the room to prove that it exists, something that Tesla did as well. Tesla and Faraday both believed in ether, and I don't think anyone would contest their knowledge of the universe, especially electricity. For those of you who haven't heard about this, well, ether is a finite particle that might be the most fundamental particle, we don't know, that essentially bounces around the universe in all directions at all times. And it is this wind of energy, is what ether means, I believe, that creates gravity and that creates what we see as electricity. But it also, if you take it down to the fundamental size of an atom, you start to explain what all of these classifications of moving energy, like electrons, neutrons, and protons, are made out of. It's all ether bouncing off of each other in such a way that you have gravity, in such a way that you have different angles of this orbital ether and ricocheting ether. When those two collide, you get an electron. All of a sudden, the world and the universe becomes amazingly clear once you adopt ether. Now, I'm going to repeat a little bit of what I've said throughout a lot of episodes, but because we're headed in a specific direction, it's important you have this foundation. Ether provides gravity in one very simple way. Just like two people standing in a windy park, like today, when you stand 100 feet from each other and it's a bunch of wind around you, you can't sense the person 100 feet away. There's too much distance between your chests, and there's too much random chaotic wind that you just don't feel them. But if you were to stand 2 inches from each other in a really windy day, both of you would feel a relief on your chest, which would be negative pressure, less wind hitting your chest because the back of the person in front of you blocks your chest, your back blocks the energy hitting their chest. And that negative energy, when you don't have an earth to stand on, will drag you together. So two bodies being hit randomly by wind, the closer they get, the more that they will be pushed together. It's the most simple model of gravity that you ever have to hear, and that's all you have to hear. And the thing is this, when you start talking about orbits are brought on by gravity that isn't able to conclude its fall, right? What that means is if you were to take a satellite and lift it in the air 80 miles and drop it, well, it's going to come right back down to Earth, right? But if you push a satellite 35,000 miles an hour around the Earth in a particular orbit, which you're going to need a lot more than 80 miles, it's going to try to fall to Earth, but it's going so quickly that it keeps missing Earth, and that's what you call an orbit. It's falling and missing the Earth. Eventually, it does get sucked into the interior of the Earth. And, it just gets sucked to the surface, basically, right? So once you understand an orbit based on the principle of velocity and gravity working together, you then have orbits at the most fundamental ethereal levels. And that's where you get electron clouds. So we're going to keep coming back to that model, but we can move on to the next model now, which was put forth by the gentleman that built Coral Castle. Now, the gentleman who built Coral Castle released a paper on magnetism, and it's just a PDF you can download online. And for the most part, it's just an experiment. It's an experimental document that has to use wires and magnets and wood and those kind of things to kind of recreate some of his works. Unfortunately, he never created a document that fully explained how he built Coral Castle. But he said something very fascinating, which, again, this guy didn't know Tesla. This guy never met Eric Dollard in the late 70s, early 80s. But what's interesting is how much that they tend to submit theories that work together. But the important thing is how they uniformly contradict a lot of the theories that we get in our school books today. He suggests very boldly in his document that what we've been told about what's inside the center of an atom is completely and utterly wrong, misguided, and intended to shroud the true nature of the universe. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Coral Castle, please look it up. It's just like Coral the Rock and Castle. This is a 115-pound guy who built a giant castle in tribute to the woman he wanted to marry, who lived in New York or New Jersey or something like that. He moved down to Florida and started building this weird fort, sort of fortress out of these giant 60-ton to 100-ton coral rocks. And he's 110 pounds, and he would do much of the construction by himself, including pulling the rocks off the back of flatbed trucks, something that none of us have been able to do since. When they asked him, how is he doing this? He said, well, I figured out how they built the pyramids. Over and over and over he said that. But here's what he suggested. He said in his document that at the center of an atom is a photon. And that is fascinating. This guy did what he did, right? Tesla did what he did. Mark Twain documented Tesla. Because Tesla was so introverted, Tesla, if no one had gone in there and saw what he was doing, then it would all be fable. But the fact that Mark Twain went in there, looked at it, documented it, said, look, he had lights in the ceiling with no lights up there. Every one of his machines worked, but not a single one had a wire coming out of the back being plugged into a wall. He encased himself in plasma electricity, and he could encase a guest in plasma electricity, such that it wouldn't hurt you. Tesla understood electricity 100%. And there hasn't been an individual born since him that has understood electricity 100%. There is not a single organization on planet Earth that understands electricity 100%, that is at least in the public eye. That's how amazing Tesla was. Well, the Coral Castle guy wasn't so secretive in his final result. So the nice thing about him is you can visit Coral Castle. You can see photographs of him building this place. He did work at night. And when they asked him, why do you only work at night? He said, well, what I do is based on photons. And when it's dark outside, I have less interference with what I do. Meaning if the sun was out, it would be competing with his methodology of moving these gigantic rocks. Secondly, he said, I'm not trying to reveal how I do what I do, so working at night has an added benefit that no one's watching me. It's hard to observe what I'm doing. Now, there's people that try to debunk Coral Castle, and I'm not trying to keep a magical man alive, But there's some competing logic here. What they'll say to you is, he just used pulleys and wood. Pulleys and wood. I want you to build a pulley out of telephone poles that can lift a 100-ton rock straight into the air. And I want to see you configure pulleys such that you can pull it with your hands and upright a 100-ton rock. Because I think that'll be a little bit tough, and considering that the wood that he used, I think, was maybe a 6x6 beam. And you need to account for all the electronics that were on top of the beams and the wires going down to the rocks. It's virtually every single photo. But there's one thing that no one contested. No one has ever come up with a debunking theory. There's no photographs of what I'm about to talk about with this guy. And that is that he took the rocks off of the flatbed trucks by himself. There were immigrant workers back in those days as well. And the immigrant workers were the ones that would, as they were building out the coastline, when coral rocks were dug out, they put them on back of these big giant trucks. They drive them straight to him at night. And he would tell them to go back around the corner to go essentially inside of what he had built so far. And he took them off the trucks by himself. 110-pound guy. There is a story. It's not really that important to his claim, to his accomplishment, I should say. But they said that there was 2 to 3 little boys who went around the corner once late at night and saw him taking one of these rocks off the back of the truck. And they said he was holding rocks in the shape of ice cream cones, and that he was pointing the rocks and lifting the big rock off the back of the truck. Now what's interesting is I believe those ice cream cone-shaped rocks are still at the facility today. You can still see them in photographs, but there's definitely old photographs of them. So the claim from these kids that he had these ice cream cone-shaped rocks, and essentially it's just carved out of stone, are there. He also has a really strange wheel made of magnets, which he would wind up with his arm, and it would create the electricity needed to do everything that he was doing. And this guy says that the reason why he was able to build what he built, which no one has ever remotely accomplished since, was because at the center of an atom is a photon. Eric Dollar was told that the center of the sun was a plasma ball. Very interesting. Tesla said he clocked ether at 40 times the speed of light. Faraday also came up with the same experiment. Found ether 40 times the speed of light. Yet if you go to school right now and you get a PhD in physics, you will not be able to get that PhD if your thesis happens to say, I believe that there is ether in the universe. Because you will be shaking up the institutions that have been raised by pragmatic, non-creative, left-brain thinkers that feel uncomfortable if you buck the system. Now, if you've seen every episode I've made, you know that there's a bit of a struggle in trying to itemize and isolate mass energy and life energy. When you go to a beach or a lake or a waterfall especially, or a stream, you see an interesting interplay between two things that are essentially made of the same materials at a fundamental level, but one guides the other. And they have this weird relationship between them. You know, water will definitely flow down the rocks Go off a waterfall. The beach will have a high tide and low tide based on the cycle of the day and the curvature of the bottom of the ocean. And then we have things called glaciers. Big, giant, frozen continents of water that are miles and miles thick. And because they weigh so much, they just carve the earth down below. Well, even the most subtle stream bumps into the soil and takes a little bit with it until it erodes the ground below. It's actually the most amazing interplay between two forms of energy that we can observe. At first, if you were to carve out a little river stream thing in maybe your backyard, because you have a natural water source that's always there and you want to bring it down in a stream to look pretty and sound neat, the first thing you'll do is carve it all out. And as the water comes down, in the back of your head that 10 years later, this subtle water, which looks harmless, which looks powerless to change anything, will have eroded the rock. And on some degree, whether it be a fraction of a percent or a full percent point, it will have changed its own path. Glaciers carve the earth below. Oceans erode the coasts. And isn't it interesting how these two things work together? Now I want you to think about that example. And let's just say that the soil, the rock, for this example, it could be the absolute opposite of what I'm saying. But the rock is the energy in our universe that appears to be more stable. It's my body. It's my flesh. It's cellular patterns and neuron connections and all that good stuff. And that the water in our analogy previously is your spirit. Now, what happens when you pick up a rock in a stream and you slam it against part of the stream, right? You pick up a rock out of the stream, you got another rock right there in front of you. It's got water running over. It's about quarter of an inch deep, and you slam the rock against that other rock. Technically speaking, you're hitting the water. What happens? Well, you're not converting water into something else. You're just slamming two rocks together, and you're causing the water to splash, to move quicker for a split second. It's as if the rock cannot affect the water. The water, like Bruce Lee said, just moves around, takes the form of a teapot. Be the water. But what if your spirit was very similar? And this reality that we're so sure is just mass, is actually the mold by which an ever-flowing spiritual energy bounces into it. A friend of mine recently suggested that crystals are people. Now, I know that, again, there's too many people associated with crystals who are embarrassing to any scientific principle that is within crystals. So I realize if I say and suggest for a second that a crystal could have a consciousness, it's going to seem like I'm one of these folks that are doing a bunch of other weird things in their lives. We are crystalline-based, silicon-based life structures, right? I mean, we do have at the most fundamental level a lattice that obeys a certain rule. Now, when we grow up, we look like human beings, puppy dogs and cats, a eucalyptus tree, a palm tree, right? So when we look at crystals and they're very uniform, we don't see life because it didn't look like us. But what's interesting is you wouldn't really question whether or not a rose bush has some form of life in it, right? I think most people realize that plants have just as much consciousness, if not more consciousness, than we do. They've been around a hell of a lot longer, I'll tell you that much. But what makes a stream versus a pond versus a lake versus an ocean versus some evaporating cloud in the atmosphere you can't really see? Well, it's because something gives it form. Gravity yanks a bunch of water down to its surface. ethereal winds pushing down on it, because no ethereal winds can come up from the bottom because the earth blocks it. It gets sucked down to the surface, pushed down. And through the ridges of the base of the Grand Canyon, you have a stream that goes right down the center of the Grand Canyon. Okay. So in one form, we can say that energy trapped is energy that can be classified and given a name. The Hadron Collider, the CERN Hadron Collider, is working on the principle that everything that gets sensed by the sensors of the various collision points, the four main receptors of the Hadron Collider, they're using a sigma 5 algorithm to say this energy, which is the same as that energy, is moving in a particular speed, velocity, orbital spin pattern, and therefore it is classified as this. And they've got everything already classified from previous, 4 decades of colliders all around the world. And what they're looking for are new signatures, new sigma 5 metrics that says we've never seen this energy before, and we're going to give it a name. And they're able to use those algorithms to figure out generally how much energy is in the wave to figure out its overall magnitude. Okay. Well, that's why we have a name like a pond versus a lake versus an ocean, a stream versus a river. It is its overall form and magnitude that changes, that gives it a distinction, but it's still water. Yes, some of it has salt in it because a bunch of fish take craps in it and die in it. I guarantee you, if you don't recirculate the water in a pond or a lake, it'll be pretty salty if you have a high population of fish content in there. So here we are, a living being. We are familiar with our consciousness. We don't know what it is. There's not a single soul that I have met or heard speak or read written that has any drop on what we are, period. And I think it's fascinating that that's the case. But have you ever wondered how it is that there are animals on planet Earth that are utterly massive, like a whale? I don't know if there's any being bigger than a whale. But then we have little tiny insects that are so microscopic, you can't see them with the human eye. I mean, think about single-cell creatures. They have a little consciousness inside them. You can see them working hard to stay alive, to multiply, to eat, to excrete. We talked about the power of 10 when I opened up the conversation. We know that regardless of how far away the sun is, what it is, it's pretty damn big. It's a lot bigger than me, personally. We understand that the tiniest little stream that you might create in like electric water fountain inside your house to make a nice little waterfall sound in your living room, it's generally made of the same exact stuff that a gigantic Pacific Ocean's made out of. The only difference is you have a very small portion of water, and the ocean's got a big portion of water. So I'm going to ask you to think about this question, because it's kind of it's a mind bender, all right? Do souls have different sizes? Does a big giant whale have a different sized soul than me? Does an ant have a really small soul as compared to my own? It's an interesting question, right? If you've ever seen a brood of ants work together to get across a watery river, especially during a monsoon, they start to look like a hive mind, single-cell creature, like a sort of a nebulous, globular creature as they hang on to each other's tails, and a bunch of them create a little pad that floats on the water as they take little air bubbles and they hold it down so that they can breathe. As the whole brood makes it across some river, some little tiny puddle in the rainforest, and then as soon as they hit the surface, they seem to unwind and go back to their individual tasks. It's one of the most fascinating things I think I've ever seen in my life when it comes to trying to see the transformation or the formation of what might be a single-cell, single-soul creature. It's odd. When you see an anthill work together, it looks like a bunch of different soldiers doing what they got to do, right? There's the little soldiers that fight. There's the gatherers. And all of a sudden, when they're threatened, it's almost as if they come together as one, beast, one little creature. I mean, if you literally just if you did a computer model to simulate drawing the volumetric parameters of all the ants in a brood just before a monsoon, you have this sort of octopus-shaped thing, right, with 1,000 tentacles where they're all looking for food. And as soon as they find food, they're leaving a chemical trail, leaving the brood. And as soon as they find food, they follow the chemical trail back, but they're dropping a new trail that says this is where the food is. But again, it rains, and they all come together. So now there are thoughts that we have from time to time where we think, oh my God, I have absolutely no mechanism to process this thought. Therefore, it can't be, first of all, it can't be considered usually in the brain. But then the second thing is we say, well, that can't be true because I can't conceive of what you're saying. When I say that crystals could have consciousness, which is the idea that my friend presented to me, the interesting thing about that is you have a crystalline structure that is, if anything else, a very intensely organized lattice of atomic mass. We know for a fact, because we use them in radios, right? It used to be crystal radios forever, that it's the crystal that actually allows us to send a radio frequency at a particular frequency across the ocean back in the day. And it was only that crystal inside the radio that could pick up the signal on the other side and resonate it back into a speaker so we could hear it. There was the old story about when the Titanic was sinking. There was some tropical area where they had built huts out of various levels of bamboo and things, and they said that inside the huts was a lot of crystal residual materials, and that when the Titanic, I think it was the Titanic, was calling Mayday, maybe it was the Lusitania for all I know, but there was some ship that was sinking, and they said that they could hear the Mayday calls inside the hut roofs because it just had so much crystalline residual stuff in the organic nature of this stuff that they could hear it. It was sugar cane or something, I don't know. But it makes complete mathematical sense. If you have any suspicion or belief in a spirit that resides as a symbiotic relationship to your consciousness, then the idea that a crystal having consciousness should be pretty easy for your brain. What kind of consciousness? Who knows? I've never had a conversation with an ant, but he seems to be a pretty smart little dude. I haven't had a conversation with a whale, but it seems to definitely have its life force. For those of you who've ever dabbled in artificial intelligence or studied robots in relation to AI, you'll know that one of the reasons why we can't seem to create a humanoid android that's like Data from Star Trek is that the very fundamentals of creating a simulation of humanity is to give it a body, is to give it the five senses, and allow it to experience from birth all that we take in, and to have some, machine for its mind to be able to process the incoming information. So if you have a toaster versus a Boston Dynamics robot, you understand that the toaster, even if you gave it the knowledge, the same machine for processing its incoming information, it's going to be an inferior level of consciousness if it has to develop from square one, right? If you give it a soul that's already had a life before, there could be a much better situation here. But if you build it up from scratch as an artificial intelligence experiment, well, your Boston Dynamics robot is going to be way more intelligent than your toaster. Intelligence being only measured by the Alan Turing test, which is to say, you must deceive me that you are like me, and then I will say you're intelligent. Intelligence would probably be best itemized as prediction. The moment you can predict something is the moment you have intelligence. Knowing something isn't that intelligent. If the toaster said, well, I know you made a piece of bread on Monday at 5 a.m., and another piece of toast on, for your spaghetti at 6 p.m. the next day, it would know things. But unless it can go, well, It's Monday, and for the last 4 Mondays you've always made bread in the morning at 5 a.m. I bet you're going to do it again. There's no intelligence in it, right? But now what if whatever level of current it can create with life force, let's say it's something like water, maybe even made of the same stuff everything else is made out of. What if the consciousness from one toaster could go into another toaster, and for some reason it has memories, kind of like your Westworld residual experience that keeps going back, keeps rolling up to these hosts over and over and over again. Within a toaster might be born, might be created and gain life with an existing intelligence. I'm not really saying this is happening. But when you take a crystal, for instance, it's a natural formation. Man does not have to make a crystal. Man can make crystals, but the good kind that you buy come from the bowels of the earth through all kinds of different mechanisms, formed at the center of old trees, formed as a natural sedimentary rock. I mean, we're on this planet, and we have such fragile egos that we need to believe that we're the dominant race, the dominant species, in not only this planet, but the whole universe, right? There's a very interesting thing, and there's two theories to this, but for this one, I'm going to have you lean on with me, probably the latter theory. We all know about law of attraction. I have friends of mine who are technophobes. They're scared of everything technical. I can go to their office and they're like, hey, help me out with fixing up my computer, my phone, set it all up, and I'll get it all oiled up beautifully. And then I leave, and somehow their fear of technology and almost their hatred of technology makes everything break the second I leave. It is unbelievable. Now, there's two theories to that. You need sort of an existential mind to explain either one, which I think is fascinating. It's almost like you back reality into a corner, and it either results interesting. One of them is that they do a law of attraction, where they attract the reality to them, where all things break, because that's what they believe is going to take place. I believe that this is going to break because technology doesn't like me. One of my clients says that all the time. And he's right. There's a whole Twilight Zone about that too. So that's the first one. But the latter idea is actually very interesting. This is going to make your brain stretch just a little bit. But what if all mass, by sheer design, has no ability to be lifeless? What if all mass has life? Because it is the rock to the stream. And sometimes it's a little tiny stream. Sometimes it's a gigantic ocean. Sometimes it may be a whole planet that's nothing but an ocean. Maybe sometimes it's liquid. Maybe sometimes it's a solid. But it is alive. And when my friend looks at this and has no love for it, well, it breaks. He's anthropomorphized his hardware into being a living adversary. He's anthropomorphized his hardware and his software and his computer to be an enemy of him. And sure enough, that's the reality that he seems to perpetually create. Now, bringing it back a little closer to our reality before going back out into this other theory. Most of you have a friend who has a green thumb. And it doesn't even matter what they plant. It just works. It just works. It just lives. And it seems like they can't water it too much. They can't water it not enough. It just lives. But that individual has a warm heart towards plants. They love them. They have no fear around them. And that seems to be the unifying principle of their character. They love plants. They feel akin to them. And those who struggle to keep plants alive are more pragmatically approaching a plant's existence in their life as pretty much the plant is there to serve them, to look pretty. And that's when the plant starts to die. They think a plant is sort of an inanimate object that has no life. And it would seem that the plant says, well, what's happening is that your consciousness is strangling off the stream. I can take my stream anywhere I want, the plant says. And it goes, I'm just going to go into someone else's home that is more suited for my being. You know, I grew up in the Midwest where we were surrounded by green, and so you tend to, when you're living in those environments, and many of you live in those environments, you tend to gain this relationship with nature. And you tend not to live in cities because you need that green around you. Where I live today, I'm surrounded by green. It's gorgeous, man. I dig having a yard with just, millions and millions of leaves and, blades of grass around me. It's just awesome. And I've never really prioritized that in my life. It just happened on accident. But it wasn't until I was put in this environment that I've been able to keep a plant alive forever. Somehow I understand it now. But now let me take you one step further. And most of you have had this thought. If I told you that the planet Earth was a living being, could you believe me? Some of you will go, hell yeah, of course. And others will go, yeah, I don't know. I can't really see a happy face in a mountainside, so I only see things the way that I understand them, and the only thing that's really alive are things with eyes. That's why I'm a vegetarian, because plants don't have any life and they don't suffer when you destroy them. The Native Americans were, and still are, obviously, one of the more interesting and I think beautiful groups of people that humanity's ever been able to create. I almost think that they are more beautiful than any of their ancestors, either south or north or way off to the east. Their perception of the earth is second to none. I think their perception of life and the stars are second to none. Because they created the most homogeneous, beautiful, congruent theories of reality than of any race I've ever seen. They never created weird deities that they worshipped where it required for them to sacrifice a life. They didn't seem to come up with, elitist behaviors. The two things that they are I guess feared for was scalping and being Indian givers, right? Those are the two slang phrases used against them. Well, they didn't invent scalping, okay? They got scalped first by us, and then they started doing it back. That's the facts. Indian giving, well, they had a bunch of white people come over from Europe that didn't bring enough shit. And so they loaned them stuff so that they could survive, kind of looking at them like, wow, you have all this technology to sail across the ocean, but you didn't bring a blanket? You didn't bring enough food to eat? Well, here's some food, and here's our blankets, and here's some lodging. And when they said, okay, you should learn how to make these things, and you should make your own, when they went to get the stuff back, because it was only being borrowed, the entitled white people said, why, you bastards, how dare you take back what's yours? There are a lot of people that believe that the sun, if anything, is a god of sorts. It definitely supplies the base nutrition for this planet. Warmth, sunlight, so we can see where things are. There are organs in our body, right? The pituitary gland that makes vitamin D on the inside of our skulls. If it is not hit by the frequencies of the sun, it does not manufacture vitamin D. And if you do not have vitamin D, you die. One of the reasons why this world is so ill is that people don't get outside, or the sunlight's being blocked by the trails coming out of planes. A buddy of mine once said that he believed that everything had life. A coffee table, a human being, etc. And if you think about the stream and the rock, when you know that you have consciousness, I think that even though we cannot perceive it in the literal form that we would like to see things, right? We like to see the fact that the Grand Canyon exists, and at the bottom there's a little river that goes through the center of it. We like to see things that black and white. You know, it's funny that if you really think about it, human beings, before there were reflective surfaces that we could discover, which actually, because water reflects, we've always had something available. But imagine, before, the narcissist looked into the river and saw himself and fell in love with himself. What if you never could see yourself? For whatever reason, you just couldn't see yourself. None of humanity could see its own reflection. We could see each other, but we couldn't see ourselves. And then all of a sudden, you gave them a camera. They could take a selfie and then look at themselves. Give them a mirror and they could see themselves. Think about how the animal tests they've done in the jungles where they erect really strong mirrors and a big giant, alpha male silverback gorilla goes up and sees himself and he attacks himself in the mirror. Isn't that interesting? The first explorers of Africa in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Osa and Martin Johnson, they filmed a bunch of tribesmen. And then they went and developed the film and came back the next year and showed them on a big projection screen with a projector the village. And individuals would see individuals inside the footage that they didn't recognize. But they knew everyone in the village, and they were like, well, who's that person? And one of the Africans in the village would say, that's you. And the chief, there's a beautiful footage of this, you can go look it up. They started laughing, which means they were having trouble processing the information. It was merely the perception of themselves that was confusing their mind and making them go, laughter is when two things collide that you can't deal with. That's what laughter is. That's why when a comedian makes a far out joke, it's funnier than one that's you could have seen coming a mile away. You don't laugh at things if you can predict what's coming. So why did I go on about the atom, and why have I gone on about the various metaphors of life as we know them to exist? Because I want you to think for a split second that all the answers to this stuff are right in front of our face. What if at the center of an atom was a soul? What if the power of 10, the concept that things go in a macro, large way infinitely, and they go in a micro, small way infinitely? What if consciousness is interwoven inside the anomalies of the ether? What if a soul could be infinitely large and a soul could be infinitely small? What would limit it in such a way? Does it have a little CPU and a hard drive and a sound card? Is there a minimum amount of mass that a soul must occupy? Is there really any 3D space on a realm that is pure consciousness? What if the sun is alive? What if the earth is alive? George Carlin did a great bit about the earth being alive. And he talked about plastic bags and, all the recycling anomalies that we have, the pollution in the sky and all that good stuff. And he said, don't worry about Earth. She's a big girl. Been around for a really long time. Maybe the Earth wanted some plastic, and so it created man to make plastic. I think that's very fascinating. But what is life without intent? If you have no intent except to exist, then maybe you're more like a crystal. You have life, but it's a very mundane, interesting, peaceful, Zenish existence. You simply are a crystal. You simply are a planet. You simply are a sun. Maybe you live forever, maybe you don't. Hell, maybe you swap jobs. Maybe you take planet Earth for a little while, and maybe you swap out and become Mercury for a little while. Someone else takes on Earth's consciousness. Most of us believe that fetuses gain their soul way before they're born. We don't know what that is, but that's sort of how we think of it. Baby starts kicking and singing and doing all kinds of cool things inside the mother. So it's a teeny tiny collection of cells that seems to have a consciousness, instinctual consciousness. almost previous life consciousness. Children are born all the time that remember living in previous villages, and they take them to those villages, and they know where houses are, they know where people are, they can talk about people's last names. It's not perfect, but it's a hell of a lot more accurate than waking up from a dream. But then those little babies become gigantic, 6'5" athletes sometimes. Well, did their soul get bigger? There are obviously rules and limitations to how the universe allows life to proliferate, right? I have never seen a relative of mine walk around my house after they've lost the bond with their body. Never seen that. I've definitely had my spiritual experiences with things that have passed, human beings that have passed, but never in some literal way. We don't celebrate Day of the Dead in Mexico, and all of a sudden the streets are full of all the spirits of those who have passed just to come back and say hello to their loved ones. We've never experienced that, at least with our current consciousness that is today. Maybe in the past they did. Maybe we've had those frequencies closed off. Who knows? When you take a drug like LSD, for instance, real LSD, you start to see sacred geometry all over, everywhere. And you have to explain how it is that you're seeing beautiful, gorgeous, perfect, sacred geometry. It's literally geometry that you'll see in tiles on the floor, inside carpet, tapestries, in paintings on walls. Our ancestors saw these patterns or developed these patterns through various illustrating techniques that were very disciplined mathematical techniques, like Escher making his Escher prints, carving them into the trunk of a tree. There is a rhyme and there is a reason and there is a method to this universe, for sure. There seems to be a definition of beauty and symmetry. I'm going to throw this last one at you here, and I don't think I've put it in a previous episode, but if I have, I apologize. I've got about 6 or 7 in the queue that I haven't edited. Been extremely busy. It's easier for me to record these than to edit these, of course. But isn't it interesting that the human body is almost 100% symmetrical? On the outside, for sure. My left hand is the opposite of my right hand. Every single thing from my tip of my head to the bottom of my toes is attempting to be as symmetrical as possible. But look at the inside of our organs in our body. How come it got all asymmetrical inside? The lungs are symmetrical. My intestines aren't. My liver, my spleen, my heart. The heart's not even symmetrical. Isn't that interesting? How would you change your life if everything was alive? If your washer and dryer had some life force in it, simply because it exists. I don't want you to necessarily anthropomorphize everything in your life, but the idea is, what if it was? What if everything had some character to it? Its own little thought process. And what if the thought process was limited to its form? So a rock is very basic life force. It merely hums its existence. It doesn't really think about writing poetry. It just enjoys being a rock. And a plant that is going through all kinds of seasonal cycles, blooming, pollinating, what have you, being pollinated. It has a whole different ecosystem. Maybe it feels warm and cozy when it can bear fruit. Man makes a lot of things, right? I'm staring out here at the telephone poles, a lot of really cool wiring that keeps our cable going and our electricity going. And this stuff was pretty much inanimate mass in some chaotic form on the planet Earth until man brought it together and made it what it is. A tire on your car doesn't just give, there's nothing that gives birth to a tire. We make that. We use sacred geometry to create it. But when it's there, it's there. We don't like to think about it, but even if you believe in a God or centralized consciousness, there's math that made us. So we're sort of like a washing machine, aren't we? We pretty much are sure we're alive and we have consciousness. So what's the difference between the universe barfing us out and us barfing a chair, a car, a barbecue? What's the difference? The only difference is that we were the workhorse that created a few inanimate objects, But maybe when you put mass together, it's alive, that all of it's alive. That the idea and the fabric of the central consciousness to the universe, the idea of God, is nothing more than all life forms communicating with each other. If you hear music right now, it's my neighbors. I think you feel me. I wanted to put this forth because I think this episode is not really about any conclusive argument either way. What it is a mechanism for you to see what you hadn't seen before, possibilities and relationships that you hadn't seen before, so that you can come up with your own conclusions. If you like the series, please subscribe. If you like this episode, please like. mkultraradio.com for the feed, and Deep Thoughts Radio for one of the latest episodes. Eventually we'll get this all combined. Thanks for stopping by. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.